There is ample evidence of sexual relations from forced to what appear to be relatively symbiotic romantic partnerships between white slave masters and black women in the antebellum South. Much rarer were intimate relations between white women and black slave men, yet they too occurred. Using an intersectional socio-historical analysis, this video explores the factors that contributed or may have contributed to the incidence of intimate encounters between elite white women and slave men, the power dynamics embedded in them, and their implications in terms of intimate consent. This video demonstrates how upper-class white women who engaged in these relationships used sex as an instrument of power, simultaneously perpetuating both white supremacy and patriarchy. A slave girl is raised in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. The lash and the foul talk of her master and his sons and her teachers. When she is 14 or 15, her owner or his sons, or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped and starved into submission to their will. Jacob's account of the sexual violence endured by slave women is merely one of many. Not all intimate encounters between masters and female slaves would be considered forced according to most definitions of the term. Concubinage-type arrangements and even long-term romantic partnerships, perhaps most famously that of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, were known to exist. But what of sexual relations between planter-class white women and slave men? Under what conditions did they occur? How should they be described in terms of power, agency, and consent? Answering these questions involves analyzing historical records through the lens of power relations, parsing through the complexities of racial, class, and gender hierarchies. As guardians of the home, planter-class white women were responsible for upholding traditional Christian values and keeping peace within the domestic sphere. As such, they were valued for their homemaking abilities, maternal instinct, and, perhaps above all else, their virtue. As one letter to a South Carolinian periodical geared toward young women put it, "If a female possesses beauty, wealth, and, in short, all the accomplishments which wealth can purchase, without virtue she is nothing worth. Her accomplishments may be admired by some for a little while, it is true, but she will never be truly esteemed." Women were seen as physically and intellectually inferior to men. White women's sexuality was heavily regulated by law as well as by culture. Adultery was considered a greater offense for women than for men, and was punished more harshly. Similarly, giving birth out of wedlock was considered much more of a social problem for white women than for anyone else. The Southern way of life and the institutions that defined it, white supremacy, slavery, and the planter aristocracy, were inextricably linked with the sexual regulation of women, especially upper-class women. The purity of white women, when contrasted with the sexually lascivious Black Jezebel archetype, served to highlight the alleged superiority of white womanhood, and by extension, whiteness. If plantation mistresses could live above reproach, their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers could boast of the superiority of their civilization. The sullying influence of slavery must not touch the women of the upper class lest the entire structure crumble. Coupled with the notion of elite white female sexual virtue was that of white female vulnerability, the idea that plantation wives and daughters needed to be protected, defended, and sheltered. Framing women in this way served as a means of patriarchal control. As political scientist Iris Young, 2003, explains, the role of the masculine protector puts those protected paradigmatically, women and children, in a subordinate position of dependence and obedience. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy. The resulting child might have been sold into slavery, but infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding scandal. Indeed, planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands. Their freedom and mobility was severely limited. For example, they were generally not allowed to travel without an older male chaperone. Spousal abuse was often considered a legitimate method for men to control their wives. Clinton calls Southern plantation mistresses prisoners in disguise. This is undoubtedly an exaggeration, but the fact remains that upper-class white women, whatever luxuries their privileged race and class status afforded them, faced a unique set of limiting patriarchal dicta. Indeed, in private, many plantation women were unhappy with their lack of freedom and the expectation that they remain dutiful, obedient, pleasant, and cheerful, while their husbands had affairs with or raped female slaves. Knowing that the mixed-race slave children who surrounded them were their husbands' offspring was both humiliating and heartbreaking. Southern women, who generally married at a younger age than those in the North, not infrequently at 15 or 16 years old, were often left abandoned on plantations while their husbands traveled for business, pleasure, or military duty. The life of a plantation mistress was often lonely and sad. Sex between white women and male slaves. An overview. The fact that affairs between planter-class women and slaves were relatively uncommon is unsurprising. White women in the South were sexually restricted as compared to their male counterparts, and 19th century contraceptive techniques were not nearly effective or accessible enough to ward off the possibility of pregnancy. Still, intimate contact between white women and black men did occur in slaveholding societies more often than perhaps many are aware. The following is a list of factors that did or may have contributed to the incidence of such relations. First, even though the sexuality of Southern white women was, as stated, heavily regulated, women were not as entirely sexually repressed as one might assume. According to historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese, slaveholding culture emphasized control of female sexuality. It did not deny its existence. She says that white women had a striking lack of neurotic inhibition. Like their husbands, Southern women had pre-ins and extramarital sex, though not as often. The dangers of having intimate relations with a black man rather than a white man were enormous in terms of the possibility of producing a mixed-race child. However, although birth control and termination methods in the 19th century were not as widely used, safe, or accessible as they are today, they existed. Condoms made out of animal skin, membrane, oiled silk, and rubber were used along with other contraceptive techniques to prevent pregnancy. For much of the 19th century, abortion was largely unregulated. And it was not limited to poor, immigrant, or black women. Upper and middle-class white women, too, had abortions. This would have allowed white women to have affairs with black men, with some level of confidence that they would not be caught. There is also a possibility that affairs between white women and slaves were simply not noticed or recorded as often as they occurred. While it may have been expected to a certain extent that white men would transgress morally, for example by having relations with slaves, a white woman choosing to have intimacy with a black man might not have been considered a likely occurrence. Additionally, an upper-class woman under suspicion of an affair with a slave could readily invoke images of chastity in order to allay trouble for herself, or in other words, accuse the slave of rape. Because black men, like black women, were seen as inherently lustful and prone to sexual vice. For an elite woman to have illicit intimacy with a black rather than a white man might have been a slightly safer bet. It was easier to blame a black man of rape than a white man. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy. The resulting child might have been sold into slavery, but infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding scandal. Of course, scandal was not always avoided. In his 1837 autobiography, former slave Charles Ball describes meeting the daughter of a wealthy planter in one of the lower counties of Georgia, who had given birth to a mixed-race son. The family considered sending her out of state until the birth, but instead the girl was kept in her father's house until the birth of her child, which she was not permitted to nurse, it being taken from her. She was degraded from her rank in society, and her child was sold into slavery. Indeed, there is considerable documentation of white women coercing black men into having sex. According to Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War, "I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them." One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. These are just two examples of the many stories abolitionists like Hinton told to prove the immorality of slaveholding. Another way in which white women were able to exercise sexual control over slaves was by threatening to accuse them of rape or attempted rape if they did not agree to intimacy. In doing this, elite white women used one of the primary instruments of patriarchal repression: the idea that they were weak and in need of white male protection, and by extension in need of control and domination by white men, to exercise racial control over slaves. Instead of attempting to dismantle the white patriarchal hegemony that oppressed both slaves and, to a lesser extent, white women, predatory white women who coerced slaves into intimacy through threat of rape opted to perpetuate both white supremacy and patriarchy by reinforcing paternalistic notions of female sexuality. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated. But perhaps, at least on a subconscious level, sexually exploiting slaves was a means of compensating for their lack of power in other aspects of their lives. Again, planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands and lacked considerable sexual agency relative to men. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. This is not to excuse the actions of sexually abusive white women, nor is it to suggest that female sexual abuse of slave men would not have occurred had women enjoyed a higher status in society. However, just as slave-owning white women often took out their frustrations on slaves through excessive cruelty and violence, they probably also used intimacy as a means of domination and control in a society in which they were relatively powerless.